You are not asking for too much. You are asking the wrong person to give it. When you love someone who runs, avoids, shuts down, or disappears when you need closeness, it's easy to think you're the problem, that you're too needy, too emotional, too intense. But you're not. You're human, and you're allowed to want connection, to want security, to want love that shows up, not just love that's promised in words and abandoned in actions. And yet, you're still here hoping they'll change. Here's the truth most people never hear. You don't get an apology from an avoidant by waiting for them to come around. You don't get change by begging, convincing, or proving your worth to someone who was never emotionally available to begin with. You get that apology when you become the loss. You get that realization when you stop chasing clarity and start becoming the clarity. You get their regret when you start acting like someone who knows they never deserved to be an option in the first place. Here's what you do. You stop giving them access to the parts of you they took for granted. You stop responding to breadcrumbs with banquet-level effort. You stop showing up for someone who hides every time you need something real. And I know letting go feels like failure. It feels like you're giving up. But listen closely, you're not giving up. You're stepping up. You're choosing yourself in a way they never could. You're no longer playing the supporting role in their fear-driven script. You're rewriting your own. And something powerful happens when you do this. The person who once dismissed your needs will suddenly notice your silence. They'll feel the absence of your warmth. They'll remember how much easier their life felt when you were in it. And they'll begin to realize what they pushed away. But by the time they're ready to apologize, you'll be too far healed to need it. So often when you're involved with someone who is emotionally avoidant, you start to feel like your needs are somehow wrong. You begin questioning yourself constantly. Was I too intense? Did I push too hard? Maybe I should have said less, wanted less, needed less. It's a toxic cycle. You replay moments in your head, trying to figure out what you did to cause their distance. And because they withdraw without warning or explanation, you're left with silence that screams louder than words ever could. Over time, this silence becomes internalized. You start thinking that maybe you are the reason they couldn't show up. But let me be clear, wanting closeness, wanting reassurance, wanting someone to be emotionally present with you is not too much. It's not excessive. It's not a weakness. It's a basic emotional need. The problem is never that you cared too much. It's that they were incapable of receiving it. Avoidants are conditioned to believe that intimacy is threatening, that emotional closeness requires too much of them, that vulnerability will somehow lead to pain or entrapment. And when someone operates from that belief system, even your love, even your gentle, patient, compassionate presence can feel like pressure to them. It doesn't mean your love is wrong. It means they're not ready for it. But the tragedy is that instead of acknowledging their own limitations, avoidants often make you feel like you're the one who's flawed. They might say you're overwhelming. They might pull away when you're vulnerable, go silent after emotional moments, or shut down when you try to connect more deeply. All of that makes you feel unsafe in expressing yourself, like you have to dilute your truth just to keep them around. And that's when you start to shrink. You dim your light, soften your needs, and tiptoe around your own emotions. You become someone who is more concerned about not losing them than about staying connected to yourself. And that's dangerous, because little by little, you begin betraying yourself in order to keep the peace. You learn to stay silent when you need to speak. You learn to wait instead of ask. You convince yourself that if you just give it more time, they'll come around. But they don't. Not because you didn't love them enough, but because they never learned how to love without fear. They were never taught that intimacy isn't weakness. It's the foundation of meaningful connection. And so they resist it even when it's safe, even when it's real. So no, you're not too much. You were simply loving someone who couldn't receive what you were offering. There's a profound difference between being too much and being too much for them. That distinction matters. You're not dramatic because you want clarity. You're not needy because you want to feel secure. You're not overreacting because you expect consistency. These are the cornerstones of a healthy relationship, and anyone who makes you feel guilty for expressing those things is showing you where they are in their own emotional development. The avoidant person may not be trying to hurt you, but their coping mechanisms do hurt you. And it's okay to acknowledge that even if they can't, once you understand this, everything starts to shift. You stop apologizing for your emotional depth. You stop editing yourself to be more digestible. You start realizing that your sensitivity is a gift, not a liability. And more importantly, you begin to see that love isn't supposed to feel like a battlefield where you're constantly justifying your existence. It's supposed to feel like home, a place where your heart is held, not questioned. You weren't too much. You were asking for something real, and there is nothing wrong with that. When you're involved with someone who has avoidant tendencies, the more you chase them, the further they seem to pull away. It's confusing because you think that if you just show them more love, more patience, more understanding, they'll eventually soften. You believe that if you explain how much you're hurting, they'll finally listen. But avoidants don't respond to emotional pleas in the way you hope. They don't move closer when you ask them to. Instead, they often retreat deeper into themselves. That retreat sends a powerful but painful message that your needs are too loud for their comfort. So you try to become quieter, you reach out less. You convince yourself that being easygoing, low maintenance, and endlessly patient will earn their affection. But in reality, all of this only reinforces their behavior. They learn that they can continue avoiding responsibility, continue withdrawing, and you'll still be there, waiting, hoping, holding space for someone who rarely shows up for you. This dynamic places all the emotional labor on your shoulders. You become the bridge, the glue, the emotional anchor in a one-sided relationship. You overcompensate. You try harder when they give less. You text more often, initiate every conversation, manage every emotional issue, and then wonder why you feel so drained. It's because you're operating from a place of fear. The fear of losing them, of pushing them too hard, of saying something that will finally make them disappear for good. But here's what you need to understand. Avoidants don't wake up to their behavior because you explain it to them. They wake up to their behavior when you stop rewarding it. The moment you detach, not out of revenge or manipulation, but from deep self-respect, you create a disruption in the dynamic they've grown comfortable with. They expect you to pursue. They expect you to stay. When you don't, they feel it. It challenges the script they've written in their mind about you always being available, always being the one to mend things, always being the one who forgives without conditions. Suddenly, you're not following the old pattern. You're not feeding their avoidance with attention. You're not pleading for validation anymore. You're quiet, not cold, not cruel, just unavailable. And in that space, they are left with themselves, with their discomfort, with the silence they once used to control the situation. That shift in energy is powerful. It's not passive. It's not giving up. It's the most active thing you can do for yourself. Detachment says, I see this pattern and I choose to step out of it. It says, I value peace more than I value convincing someone to care. And make no mistake, this energy shift doesn't go unnoticed. When someone who has always had emotional control over you senses that you're no longer tethered to their moods, their attention, their approval, they begin to notice what they've taken for granted. They start to feel the gap where your presence used to be. That's when regret begins to build, not because you begged for it, but because you stopped giving them the fuel they needed to maintain their emotional distance. You're not being dramatic when you pull away. You're not playing games. You're reclaiming your emotional power. You're saying, I will no longer shrink myself to keep a connection that only thrives when I disappear into silence. Detachment is a declaration. It tells the universe and the other person that you are no longer subscribing to the belief that love should be earned through suffering. You deserve connection that doesn't require you to chase it. And by detaching, you finally allow yourself to receive the kind of love that begins with self-respect. In the space that follows, they may finally understand what they've lost. But by then, you'll already be living like someone who never needed their permission to heal. There's a moment in every emotionally exhausting relationship where something shifts inside of you. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. So quiet it almost feels unnoticeable. But that moment is when everything changes. That's when you realize you're no longer waiting. You're no longer hoping for them to magically become who you needed all along. Instead, you start pulling your energy back. You start taking your heart out of their hands and putting it back where it belongs, with you. That's the moment you begin to become the loss they never expected. You stop being the person they could count on to always forgive, to always reach out, to always patch things up. And when that version of you disappears, they begin to feel something they haven't had to feel in a long time: consequence. Avoidants build their relationships on the belief that you'll always be there. They rely on your predictability, your care, your emotional presence. They pull away, but they assume you'll reach back. They act indifferent, but deep down, they know you'll stay. That dynamic is what allows them to keep avoiding, because they've never really had to face the weight of their own actions. They've never truly felt what it's like to lose you, not for real, not in a way that changes them. But when you detach and hold that boundary, when you stop performing emotional labor on their behalf, they're left with silence. A silence they used to weaponize, now turning back on them. It's in that silence that the realization begins. Not overnight, not instantly, but gradually. They start noticing the small absences, your good morning texts, your check-ins, your reassurances, your emotional support. They start reaching out to you in subtle ways, maybe even confusing ones. A message here, a like there, a question out of nowhere. At first, it won't sound like an apology. It won't sound like responsibility, because avoidants don't know how to walk directly toward the pain they've caused. They only know how to circle it, how to approach it indirectly. But make no mistake, the loss is setting in. They're not just missing you. They're starting to miss the version of themselves that only existed when you were loving them. They may not know how to say it, but they'll feel it. The space you created in their life was sacred. You were the one who stayed when they were cold. You were the one who listened when they were distant. You saw the parts of them they were afraid to even look at. And now that you're gone, they're left with the emptiness that comes from avoiding the very thing they secretly wanted: real intimacy. That's when the apology starts to form, not just in words, but in regret, in the way they replay old conversations, in the way they start to recognize how much emotional safety you brought to the table, in the way they begin to wish they'd done it differently. And maybe they'll come back and say it. Maybe they'll finally admit that they hurt you. Maybe they'll express remorse and want to rebuild. But even if they don't, you've already done the most powerful thing you could possibly do. You became the loss they have to live with. Not because you wanted to hurt them, but because you finally chose to stop hurting yourself. You stopped pouring into a place that couldn't hold you. You became the memory they now carry, the standard they never lived up to, the person they'll look for in everyone else and won't find. Because no one loves quite like the person who stayed long after they should have left. And when that person finally walks away, it echoes. It stays, and it changes everything. There comes a time when your silence becomes more powerful than any explanation you could ever give. When you're dealing with someone who continually avoids responsibility, evades hard conversations, and emotionally checks out every time things get real, trying to prove your point becomes exhausting. You start writing long texts they never truly read. You have vulnerable conversations that end in deflection, defensiveness, or flat-out withdrawal. You begin every discussion with the hope that this time will be different, that this time they'll finally understand you. But it always circles back to the same pattern, you explaining yourself in circles, and then retreating, dismissing, or making you feel like the problem. And at some point, you realize that nothing you say will ever matter more than what you do. That's when you stop trying to convince them of anything and start showing them through your actions that your peace means more than their approval. You don't get through to someone by begging them to care. You don't inspire change by lowering your standards. You rise by standing in your worth quietly and powerfully. When you begin to set boundaries, not with bitterness, but with clarity, you are saying, I won't shrink to keep this connection alive. It's not anger that makes you walk away. It's the decision to no longer abandon yourself. That is what makes the biggest impact. Avoidants often expect you to be the one who bends. They know how to withhold affection just long enough to make you question your value. But when you stop seeking closure and start enforcing your limits, the dynamic starts to unravel. They are no longer in control of your emotional reactions. You're no longer handing them the steering wheel. You're no longer trying to explain why your feelings are valid. You're acting like they are. There's a calm kind of power in saying less, in responding with boundaries instead of arguments, in not replying when you're baited into emotional chaos. That silence, it's not coldness, it's wisdom. It's the wisdom that says, I don't need to attend every emotional battle I'm invited to. You start to notice that the more you stay rooted in your self-respect, the less you're interested in proving yourself to someone who doesn't treat you with care. You stop over-explaining, you stop justifying, you stop giving energy to someone who has repeatedly shown that they won't meet you in the middle. This doesn't mean you don't feel hurt. Of course you do. But instead of begging for recognition, you begin to channel that pain into growth. You realize that your energy is better spent healing rather than convincing someone that you are worthy of being loved right the first time. You reclaim the emotional space that was consumed by worry and anxiety. You reinvest in yourself. And slowly, you begin to see that real respect never needs to be begged for. It's either there or it isn't. And that's when they start to notice. Maybe not immediately, but eventually, the attention they took for granted is gone. The effort they overlooked is missing. The person they assumed would always be there no longer responds the way they used to. And in that space, they are confronted with the one thing they've avoided all along, the reality of their own behavior. They may try to test the waters with small messages, vague attempts to reconnect, or even guilt trips disguised as concern. But your response, or lack of it, says everything. You're not playing games. You're protecting your peace. You're not withholding affection. You're withholding access. And that's what finally forces them to sit with themselves. The moment you start choosing yourself over proving your point, you reclaim your power. Not by being louder, but by being still. Not by making them understand, but by understanding yourself. You're not walking away because you want them to chase you. You're walking away because you no longer want to chase someone who runs from love. And in doing so, you become the very mirror they've spent years avoiding. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting for someone to apologize, when you no longer need them to explain why they left, why they couldn't love you the way you needed, or why they made you feel like your presence was a burden instead of a gift. At first, that silence feels like a wound. It stings, not because they're gone, but because you stayed long enough to be hurt by someone who never truly saw you. You stayed because you believed in their potential. You gave them the benefit of the doubt again and again. You told yourself that if you just held on a little longer, they'd wake up and realize how deeply you cared, how patient you were, how much love you offered without asking for anything more than consistency. But they didn't. And that realization is brutal. It makes you question everything, your worth, your judgment, your sense of what love is supposed to feel like. But then something changes. Slowly, without fanfare, without a grand moment of clarity, you just stop reaching. You stop checking their page, reading old messages, waiting for their number to light up your phone. You stop rehearsing the speech you'll give if they ever decide to come back. And in that stillness, you begin to hear a different voice, your own. The version of you that stopped begging for answers. The version of you that no longer needs to be chosen to feel valuable. The version of you that finally sees the silence not as abandonment, but as a blessing in disguise. That voice becomes louder each day you choose peace over chaos, self-worth over confusion, boundaries over longing. And here's the irony. It's usually in that exact moment, when you no longer crave their apology, that they come back. Maybe not with the full admission you once fantasized about, maybe not with all the right words, but with just enough regret in their tone, just enough softness in their approach that you know they finally felt it. They felt your absence. They felt the weight of your withdrawal. They realized what it means to lose someone who was willing to love them through their flaws, someone who held space for them in a way no one else ever did. They may not say, "I'm sorry," in the exact way you imagined, but it's there, in their eyes, in their hesitations. In the way they ask how you've been, as if trying to step back into a space they no longer have the keys to. But the beautiful thing is that by the time they finally understand, you've already outgrown the version of yourself that needed them to. You've healed the parts of you that once accepted emotional crumbs as a feast. You've stopped seeing their attention as validation and started recognizing your own power in walking away. That moment of clarity when they express what they couldn't say before, doesn't hit you the way it once would have. It doesn't flood you with relief. It doesn't spark a desire to return. Instead, it confirms what you already knew. You were never asking for too much. You were simply asking the wrong person, and now you're standing in a place of strength they never expected. The apology, if it comes, feels too small too late. Not out of bitterness, but because you've built a life where their presence is no longer necessary for your peace. Their words don't hold power anymore. Your healing does. Their attention doesn't define you anymore. Your self-trust does. You've risen from the silence not just as someone who survived being hurt, but as someone who reclaimed their worth in the aftermath. That's what true closure is. Not something they give you, but something you give yourself when you finally realize that you are always enough. The moment you stop chasing is the moment they start noticing. The moment you choose silence over struggle is the moment they begin to hear what your words never could. The moment you stop asking for what they should have freely given is the moment you finally reclaim your power. You don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to beg to be valued. You don't need to lose yourself trying to keep someone who was never showing up for you in the first place. You were never too much. You were just too real for someone who wasn't ready. And now you are becoming someone who no longer settles for emotional scraps in the name of love. Let them remember you in the quiet. Let them feel your absence like a truth they can't escape. Let them apologize, but only after you've already moved on. Because your healing does not depend on their remorse. Your freedom does not wait for their realization. You are already becoming whole without their permission. Thank you for sharing this space, this truth, and this moment with me. If you saw yourself in these words, if you felt even one line land deeply, please know this: you are not alone. You are not broken, and you are absolutely worthy of a love that feels safe, steady, and sure. Keep choosing yourself. Keep raising your standards. Keep walking in your worth. They may realize what they lost one day, but you will have already found something far greater: yourself. Until next time, take care of your heart. You deserve nothing less. Thank you.